If you've done any web development in the past, then you probably know by now that traversing across the information returned from a document is something that's a very common operation. And jQuery provides a lot of functions that make this process easier. Now, I've listed some of the functions that jQuery makes available to help with this process below. This is not an exhaustive list. Some of the functions in this area in jQuery are fairly advanced, so I've chosen the ones that are most commonly used and you'll run into again and again. So let's go over these. The first one I want to go over is the size function and length property. They both do the same thing. When you execute a jQuery expression and you get a result set back, this function or property, whichever one you prefer to use, will tell you the number of elements that are in the jQuery result set. And you can use that information in conjunction with other jQuery functions to iterate over these items or do some other operations. So you can also use this property or the function to test to see if the result of a jQuery expression came back with any elements at all, because sometimes you'll need to know that information when you're doing certain things, and we'll see an example of that later on in the course. The next two functions, get at index, that returns an array of all the matched elements as DOM elements. Now remember, in jQuery, the result set that comes back from a jQuery selection is not an array of DOM elements. Those DOM elements have been wrapped inside jQuery objects, which have a lot of functionality built on top of them. So these functions are pretty useful if you need to operate on the DOM elements themselves instead of using the built-in functions that jQuery gets you. So the get function returns an array of all the elements in the result set as DOM elements, or you can use the version that takes the index parameter, and that will get you a single element at that index as a DOM element. And the last two functions, find and each, are also pretty powerful functions. The find function can be used to search inside a matched element for other elements that match the expression. You can imagine searching inside a div for images, for example. And then the last function, the each function, is also very powerful. The each function allows you to loop over the contents of every element in the result set of a jQuery selection and execute a function against that element. And again, this is a very powerful feature of jQuery. You'll come across the need for this again and again. In fact, later on in the course, we will use the each function to solve a particular problem. So now that we've seen some of these functions and properties, let's jump over to the code and exercise them. All right, so here in the exercise files folder, I'm going to open up the traversing start file. You can read the finished version if you want, or you can follow along with me in the start one. This is the document we've been using, and it's got the paragraphs and the list items. So let's begin by exercising some of the properties and functions we've learned. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the length property to inspect the result set of a jQuery selector. So actually I'm going to display it in an alert, and I'm going to display a string that says there are plus, and then I'm going to execute my jQuery function, and I'm going to look for all the paragraph tags, and I'm going to use the length property plus, and then say p elements. So this should now show me in an alert how many paragraph elements there are. So I'm going to save and go to the browser. Okay, let's bring this up in the browser and refresh. And you can see that sure enough there are 4 p elements, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's correct. Okay. All right, so let's go back to the code. Just to show you, you can use the size function as well. So I'm going to save and refresh, and you can see that the same thing happened. Okay, let's go back to the code. This time, let's use the get functions to retrieve the DOM elements. So I'm going to write var elems equals. This time I'm going to look for all the list items. And I'm going to write get. Okay, so that's going to get me an array of all the list items as DOM elements. And then I'm going to write alert. There are plus elems.length. And this is the built-in JavaScript array length operator there, just to avoid confusion. There's li tags. So that should now produce pretty much the same result as the paragraph example, only now using the DOM instead. So let's save, and now we're going to refresh, and sure enough, there's 4 list item tags. Okay, so let's go back to the code again. All right, this time let's use just the individual index operator on the get function. So this time I'm going to write alert, and I'm going to alert li.get at 0. So this will come back with an alert showing me what kind of object is at index 0. Save, and we're going to refresh. And you can see that, sure enough, there's an object, and it's an HTML li element. And that's correct. That's that guy right there. It is, in fact, a list item, and this is a DOM element object right here. So that appears to be working. So if I wanted to work on that li tag using the DOM, I can now do that. All right, let's go back to the code. Okay, now let's get a little more fancy. Let's use the find function. So we're going to use the find function to find list items that have a class B inside of the UL tag. And you can accomplish this using selector expressions, but this is just for the sake of illustration. There are much more powerful ways to use the find. I'm just going to use this example to show you what it does. So I'm going to select the UL tag, and then I'm going to type find. And I'm going to say find list items that have the B class. And I'm going to use my same CSS trick from earlier. I'm going to set the border to 3 pixels solid red so you can see it. So what should happen is all the list items that have B applied should have a border around them. Okay, so we'll go save. And we'll refresh this in the browser. And sure enough, it worked. So the find function found those list items. One more example. Let's go back into the code. All right, now we're going to use the each function. And this is where things get really interesting. What I'm going to do is use the each function to apply progressively increasing values to the style applied to the paragraph elements. So I'm going to make 2 variables. I'm going to make a variable called left margin, and that's going to start as 0. And I'm going to make another variable called border, and that's going to start as 3. So now I'm going to write my jQuery expression to find all the paragraph tags. Then I'm going to say .each. So for each paragraph tag, I want to execute a function. And what this function is going to do is, remember, inside this function, for each one of these functions, it's going to be called the this keyword is going to refer to each one of the paragraphs as it comes through. So for each paragraph, I'm going to set the CSS property for the border to be the value of the border variable plus pixels and then solid red. So the border is going to get bigger each time. And then I'm going to say this dot CSS, only this time I'm going to set the CSS for the margin left of the paragraph to be the left margin. Then I'm going to say border plus equals 2. So the border is going to get thicker by 2 pixels each time, and the left margin is going to get bigger by 10 each time. So for each paragraph, these values are going to get larger, and we should see the visual result of that when we refresh the page. So save and go back to the browser. Okay, so now when I refresh, you're going to see each one of these paragraphs should become increasingly indented to the right, and they should each have a red border that gets progressively thicker. And you can see that that's exactly what happened. That's how you use jQuery to traverse across the elements in a web page.